once again, thank you so much. We're super excited to hear what you have to say about education and its importance in peace building. And as always, participants, if you have any questions, feel free to enter them into the chat or hit the raise your hand function, or feel free to DM me as well. Professor Nig, take it away.
Perfect. All right, I assume everybody can hear me, so hopefully if anybody has any issues, etc., I can just let Sharon know, because I can't seem to get the chat function to show while I'm sharing my screen. So just by way, for those of you that are new to the panel or who didn't get a chance to hear me last time around, my name is Nigmendra Narain. I teach in the Department of Political Science at the University of Western Ontario. I teach first-year classes and second-year classes primarily, and I'm also the chair of the undergraduate chair of the Transitional Justice minor program. And today, what I would like to do is talk to you about the role of education, especially in situations after warfare and mass social violence. But that said, my goal is not to put you into the weeds of what is called TJ or TJPC, which is Transitional Justice and Post-Conflict Rebuilding and stuff. I want to give you some idea about why this matters, and more so as a way to entree into the question about why education itself is important for us to undertake as a part of our innovation. And I'm not starting from the idea that we are here in this pandemic in a particular situation and how do we get ourselves out of it, but to ask ourselves what sort of lessons we might come away with and why we might need to pay attention to education more so and in different ways than we are seeing right now, more broadly and socially. Many of you probably have significant and very important ideas about how your own education was affected when we went into quarantine, when everything went online and so forth. Some of you may be parents or assisting with parental duties, teaching young children, or you have to take care of family members and others in that regard, or you're trying to figure out how to make a living and so forth. So your education is both impacted by what you're doing. Your education is also itself being impacted in itself, because the way you can educate yourself or others is having an effect as well. But I'm starting from the idea about why is education itself an important area for us to think about when all this sort of blows up on us, if you will. So the point is to talk about education, but the point is also to talk about empowerment, because I think it's important to realize that we're here to innovate and discuss ideas that you have for making change and bringing the change that you think is necessary in order for us to tackle not only past problems, but new problems as we go forward. So to start with, I just want to open up with, the obvious question that you're probably wondering about. So what is transitional justice and why is it the framework that I'm using? Well, because of a couple of things. First is that it involves the notion of recognition. It means that we recognize that we have a different, qualitatively, quantitatively, very different situation. There was a war, there was a civil war, there was a situation where groups were fighting each other, there were individuals that suddenly turned on each other, neighbors went up against neighbors, and family members ended up going up against family members and so forth. So transitional justice tries to bring recognition to the feelings, the emotions, and the identities that are there that suddenly have, in a sense, bubbled to the top. And we're now facing that dilemma. In fact, at some level, you can even suggest that what we're seeing in the West itself with BLM, with issues around, fascism, Nazism, supremacy debates, and so forth like that, as well as Indigenous peoples. We shouldn't forget them as well, but Indigenous peoples issues as well. These are all part of the recognition that there are problems of equity, problems of fairness, and problems of justice. Now, usually in a transitional justice situation, a key thing that is eroded is civic trust. People do not trust each other. They feel that there is a way in which their needs are not being met, that other people don't trust them to do the right thing, or that what's being asked of them to do is not right. In fact, look at the debate around masks, right? Maybe many of us on this panel are like, yeah, masks, and all of us would go, sure, yeah, masks. But maybe there's some of you sitting there, and I don't know about these mask things. And it's a question of civic trust. Do you believe our leaders? Do you believe the people that tell you this? Do you believe your colleagues have it in for you? Or do you believe that there's other things that are matter of fact more important? Why don't they think your economic priorities matter more, or your disability matters more than the requirement for a mask? So we do have questions of civic trust even today. In a transitional justice case, it's the civic trust that's lost when we're confined to groups and say, one group of people, you're part of that group and you're not part of our group, and therefore we take license to kill you or to hurt you or harm your interests. But then from there, after recognition and civic trust, we need to build a measure of reconciliation. And this is sort of the focus of transitional justice. How do we get people to come together, right? If we're in a situation of mask and no mask, for example, how do we get people to come together to address this in a way that works? So one thing is suggested that you can get medical certificates and you can show this at the door. And there's certain sort of things you can download from the government website, et cetera, get a medical certificate and do that. Now, that's one way to reconcile it. There's also problems with that, but that's effectively the same idea in the pandemic as we're seeing in the transitional justice zone, where we're trying to bring people together that have eroded measures of trust between them, but still want to operate in a society, right? At the end of the day, we don't want to simply say, okay, we're going to throw everybody who wears a mask or doesn't wear a mask or doesn't agree to sanitize their hands or whatever on a boat and then drop them off in some other part. So no, the non-mask wearers, like I'm in London, Ontario, non-mask wearers should live north of the university and pro-mask people should live south of the university. I mean, these are not ways to go about doing it, but these are ways that societies have debated about reconciling. So this is a huge problem. Then the last aspect is democratization. So in this regard, for those of you that are critical, and you should be, this is a sort of liberal project, the idea being that individuals matter, individual consent matters, that people should agree to stuff as individuals, but we also need to recognize that individuals are part of groups. So we have to figure out things like minority rights or group rights. So in a transitional situation, for example, involving Indigenous people, which Canada is currently tackling, we can't separate out individual rights of particular individual Indigenous people from collective rights of Indigenous groups in terms of group rights to resources, education, and we have to look at reconciling along issues related to what happened with residential schools and so forth. So this is where I think transitional justice is helpful for us to come at, because one of the aspects that transitional justice deals with is the question of education. We're talking about people engaging with each other, and part of that means that they have to have an understanding of various things in order to do that. So if we're looking at it in a more broad scale, just to sort of tie this together, it comes from the idea that there's mass conflict. After mass conflict, there's a state of peace that sort of emerged, as fragile or unstable as it is. We need to then engage in what are called peace building, which is we need to build the institutions, social infrastructures, the ideas, et cetera, that come together. And eventually, when we study this in transitional justice, we're trying to figure out what are the best processes to bring this about. What are the best ways to stabilize a society, to ensure and create lasting institutions and others that create for the possibility of peace. And I think a key aspect of that becomes education. And we don't mean just education of sitting in a classroom and getting instruction. We're going to talk about it a little bit more broadly. So in this regard, the question that we sort of want to come to here is, what is the role of education, right? And here I like to use a quote by Nelson Mandela: education is the most powerful weapon you can use to change the world. And in fact, I would argue to you that in times of mass upheaval, even ours, even situations that are far beyond what we're facing right now, like this is a fairly stable, organized situation, but say World War World War II and the Holocaust, apartheid South Africa, what's happening currently in parts of the world where there is still fighting going on, right? Education becomes very important on a different level, and that comes from the advice I got from our neighbor who had to run from Poland when she was 12 years old. And she would go to school, the usual round of complaints. I think we've all been there. Why do I have to go to school? Why do I have to learn? And her father cognizantly said to her, look, one day, Pearl, we may have to run from here, right? And again, this is a Jewish family, so that's sort of historically driven in the sort of narrative of the religion and through the history that Jewish people have faced as well. Other groups also, but to acknowledge for this story, the father said to her, Pearl, at some point we may have to run. And when we do, the only thing that will matter is what you can take inside your head. Your clothes, all the stuff we bought you, your bed, all that, this house goes, everything goes. The only thing you have is what's in your brain. And that's exactly what happened to her. Little girl growing up, 13 years old, the Nazis are rolling into Poland. Dad says, let's go. They basically pick up one afternoon, don't have time for toys, don't have time for anything. Grab your coat, grab your shoes, get on a boat and get the heck out of there, right? And what saved them was both her and her husband later on. He was a carpenter, she was an educator. She worked, he worked, her parents worked. They were well to do, but when they started to work in Canada, they had to take up whatever jobs, and there were a lot of discrimination that they faced as Jewish emigres and so forth like that. So consequent to that, it is what was in their brain, in their head, that actually mattered, right? So this is why I think education becomes important as a lifeline for us to think about where we want to head with it. So this then brings us to the question, does education play a role in violent conflict? And I think it does. And I think even in a pandemic, it plays a role, as we're seeing, because we're seeing issues of hate and violence and things rolling over. And we're facing these sorts of important identity issues in an era of mass upheaval. So on this side of it, I'm just going to use my pointer, which I don't think you folks can see, right? You can't see my pointer, can you?
We can see the mouse. You're good.
Oh,
You're good.
okay.
We can see
Oh,
the mouse.
okay.
Yep.
All right. So this is, in a sense, the idea that, so there's negative conflict over here, and omission, there's a passive to active approach, right? So omission was where you don't bother to talk about it. Another one is where war is routine and you say, well, look, fighting happens or social violence, we don't need to worry about it. Then if society settles down a little bit more, it sort of builds on stereotypes and allegiances. Think about when you are in a high school situation and everybody sits in their own little seats, etc., right? But imagine an entire society is based around that. And then you get into the two that are much tougher to deal with. One is you've got a defense curriculum, and that means that you make the case that these stereotypes, these allegiances, etc., are natural, they're okay, and that's the way the world should be organized. And then you finally get to what's called a hate curriculum, and this is sort of the bigger problem, and that's when you actually actively educate people in hate in order to propel the mass violence. These people are like this, they are doing that, these are the people that we need to go after, and so forth. And we face those sorts of issues today. We may suggest that, okay, well, we live in a multicultural, etc. society, but I think what the last couple of weeks have shown us is that this is a significant problem even in our society, and we need to address. Now, on the flip side over here, this is what we are all mostly familiar with in our societies. Our education teaches us to be tolerant with each other. We work out ways to deal with conflict, how to deal with racial inequality, how to deal with the problems that we face where we disagree with stuff. We're educated in humanitarian law, like, for example, human rights discussions, even inside our society, treat people kindly, don't discriminate against people because of their religion, and so forth. Then we have dialogue and encounter, where things happen, like in the classroom or in the workplace, etc., where we would have to change things around, to the point where I think we are at now, which is that we're actively looking to challenge the questions of violence and what is causing that. So a lot of the stuff that we are facing when it comes to Black Lives Matter, a lot of the stuff that we are actually trying to deal with in terms of, and it's not just Indigenous folks, etc., and it's not just in the realm of what's real. Consider, for example, a few years ago, and all of you here are tech savvy, and you probably and I mean, normally if this was a class, I'd say, how many of you use Google Google Photos, right? And a bunch of you would put up their hands. If you do it now, I can't see it on the chat. But we know that a few years ago that AI itself, Google Photos, was classifying people of dark color skin, people like myself as well, as animals. So if you went into your photo system and you looked for all your friends that were POCs, people of color, you wouldn't find them under friends or humans or others. You would find them under animals, right? So if you were Black, you would be classified as a jaguar. Someone like me may be classified as a cow because of the color of my skin, because it was determining or over determining based on skin color and things like that. We also know that the AI that Microsoft released, where it created a Twitter AI that was automatic, within like 72 hours, the thing became profoundly racist, Nazi, misogynistic, etc., because it was curtailing all the information on the web and developing a profile accordingly, right? So we have to be able to challenge the violence that is out there in the real world that we have issues with, but we also need to challenge the violence that can happen in the cyber world, right? Even Zoom itself is under analysis for the way in which people interact. Does it replicate questions of power, racism, etc., like that? So those sorts of things are a positive way to approach conflict, in the sense that the idea is to create things that make things better, that allow us to overcome this, right? Now, what happened, for example, with the Google thing, they worked on that, but it required people of color in particular and other individuals to actually pay attention to this and call attention to it and say to Google, what the heck is going on? And Google had to figure out a way to deal with this. So it's important for us to remember that we need to be moving towards active challenge to violence, and we need to keep this violence, if you will, in quotations. It isn't just, are you getting beaten up, right? We all are at a university. That violence at, like, sorry, I'm at a university. I'm not going to say everybody else on the group call is, but if you're at a university, violence is more nuanced than just, I didn't punch Sharon in the face or I did, right? It could be mistreating. It could be sort of snarky comments. It could be issues related to sex, race, gender, sexuality, location. It could be urban versus rural, etc. So we need to do that. Now, for that, we need education, and education requires at some level an active challenge, right? It's not just the idea, as Mark said, it's not just to challenge the ideas, it's actually try to think about different ways to go at those ideas. Now, in this regard, I would suggest to you that, first of all, education can create or structure a conflict, right? And we can work towards, in many ways, figuring out ways to actually cause conflict in an educational system. So let me talk to you about one situation that actually did involve exactly the structure of this conflict. For those of you that are familiar with the case of Rwanda, you might have come across this, or if you've been in my classes. But that said, in Rwanda, one of the things that was used in order to create the Rwandan genocide itself was the education system. So how many of you have done an exercise where you basically had to figure out your ancestral history? They said, oh yeah, go figure out where your grandparents are from, tell your immigration story, tell your life story, if you're 7 generations in, where you're from, etc., and submit an assignment. Now you innocuously do this because guess what? You're little kids, right? You're a 6-year-old kid. You got told to do an assignment, or you're a high school student. Heck, you're a university student. You got to do this assignment. You're like, okay, part of the politics of my family has been da 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 da. What they did was they had these kids do these assignments. The teachers took those assignments in. When the teachers took those assignments in, they often figured out which kids were Tutsi, which kids were Hutu. Then they turned those over to members of the Interhamwe or other organizations, who then took those assignments, took those kids' names, etc., and marked down doors of the Tutsis. Then, on that basis, when they had to go around at night or when the genocide started, they were able to actually go after people in those houses. Well, it's because, I mean, not to suggest that we can't tell the difference between people, but effectively, would I really know? The example I often talk to in class is, if I were to ask people in my class, how many of you are Scottish or have Scottish background or are maybe Irish, etc.? Well, if you are Caucasian, you are very likely to have some background of European, of Scottish and Irish, right? You might go, well, I have a 3rd cousin removed, or 1 cousin, da, 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 or no, we're primarily from Italy, but you know, it turns out that my great-great-grandmother, da, 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 and you might chase all that back. And if I have you turn that assignment in, now I can figure out who amongst you is Scottish. I can email the Canadian Forces, have them put an X on your door, and then drop a drone on it, right? And the consequence of that is that it's the education that is being mobilized to create, to structure, etc., conflict. So education is not neutral when it comes down to conflicts in this way. Further to that, education can retrench a conflict in a post-conflict situation. You could have a narrative that says, we didn't do anything wrong, so our educational system has nothing to apologize, and our nation has nothing to apologize for. This is a huge issue between South Korea, China, and Japan in their educational system, related to the Japanese actions across East Asia in the 1930s, right? And the Japanese, for the longest time, didn't acknowledge the comfort women, the women that they oppressed into brothels across the Pacific, from China, from South Korea, and so forth. And this continues to remain an issue between those states. But even in the South Korean and the Chinese textbooks, there is a way in which that conflict still continues on, even though it's been, an entire, well, we're in the new 1,000 years, actually, since all that happened. Further to that, it can also be used, and I think that this is where we're hopefully aiming for, is to reform and reject a conflict in a post-conflict situation. It's to say that we can acknowledge something, but say that's not the way the world needs to work, right? So we can acknowledge that there has been internment, there has been the rounding up of people, there has been the locking of doors and the marking of people with bandanas, etc., in Canada and North America towards certain groups. And there has been ghettoization and stuff like that. And these are conflict situations that people have found themselves, including genocides as well. But can we think of new ways to move forward from them? What sort of reforms do we need? What sort of rejections of those ideas and norms should we engage with in order to move towards a better way of engaging with each other and a better educational system? Just this past little while, the provincial government has now created the idea that Indigenous languages should be available in every high school so that students can learn Indigenous languages. And I'm assuming it's going to be based on where you are, that you learn the Indigenous language of the local Indigenous peoples in and around, say, the Mississauga, because that's going to be different than if you're part of a primarily Huron area, say up in the Algonquin and stuff like that. And you might be part of the same language group. The closest I can suggest to this is that if you were trying to learn quote unquote Chinese, Chinese is not a language. It's Mandarin, it's Cantonese, and then there's different dialects and so forth like that, right? So you'd want to sort of build that way. So you reject the conflict of, well, you know, we're not going to study Indigenous languages because they're dying, their people are dying, their language is dying. There's a very wrong way to approach this, to say, wait a second, no, it's important for our society to use education as a way to reject the old systems and to build new systems that are better. And one of the ways that does this, for those of you that are looking at the sort of, what are you folks capable of doing, is that there's a lot of new apps coming out that allow you to do that. And even translators are now moving into trying to create Indigenous languages so that you can listen to some of the greetings. Like somehow, you know, people will say namaste to me. I'm like, okay, namaste to you as well. But I couldn't say the same thing in Cree. I could not say the same thing in Anishinaabe. I couldn't say that in other languages of Canada, but people know namaste no matter where they are in the world, and that may be thanks to a whole host of things, but nonetheless, we haven't ever thought about that, and now people are thinking about that and thinking about it in terms of education. So what can education in a post-conflict do? Well, a couple of things. One is it can create a process for bringing us past conflict through education, through learning, and so forth. It can ensure that there's a historical memory and record. In other words, we want to make sure that there's a truth telling here that tells us about what has gone on, how people have understood the world, right? And consider, for example, if you were doing an app, there's sort of these geolocate apps currently, but they'll tell you about where London is, they'll tell you about Eldon House, etc. But the app doesn't tell you about anything related to the Indigenous peoples that are around here, right? In my own city, there is a little Indigenous museum up in the north end of it. 99% of people in London have never been. They know none of the history of the Indigenous people that are around here, and that's important. Southern Ontario is also where a lot of freed African Americans ended up after the end of the Civil War. So if you go to Chatham, there is a major museum about African American history, because it was one of the endpoints of the Underground Railroad, was people would come into Chatham. So they'd be away from Windsor, so you couldn't cross the border just to, you know, steal back or enslave people and run them back. So they would come to Chatham. But we need those memories and those records of that, but we need to be able to provide for that. So apps or other ideas or other ways to maintain that historical record, I think, are important. And oftentimes that also means for young people like yourself, listen to the stories of your uncles, your aunts, your grandparents, and others. I'm not going to suggest that the stories they tell you aren't going to be tinged with all sorts of problems. That's fine, right? I mean, at some point in the future, trust me, you're going to be thought of as sort of out to lunch on stuff, or you don't know how to really properly say it. Trust me, that happens to me. And I'm not, I mean, I'm significantly older than many of you, but I'm significantly younger than my mom in that regard. But there's ways in which things that I say now are not going to track with you folks. So we need to get that. And I think this is an important thing to do, is how to bring that to bear. And part of that can just be in different things that we do. Think of the ways in which we're doing organic vegetation now that involve Indigenous knowledges, right? And those Indigenous knowledges will be lost if you simply incorporate the chemistry of the product that you're producing and not think about the history of the context in which it was created and the peoples and their culture and so forth. And there's also the risk of then appropriation without accreditation. The other thing that education can do is change attitudes. And this is important. I would suggest that many of you are very different than where you were at the start of university, are going to be different than when you were at the start, like when you're at the end of high school, from the start of high school. And every year you move along. And education can change your attitudes. It can make them worse, it can make them better, it can solidify your hatred of a group or your love for something, etc. But education does have an impact. So how do we want to handle those changing attitudes? How must they change? We've had significant movement in the LGBTQ area because of students and kids going home and talking to their parents and talking to their grandparents and so forth in this regard. And of course, even the process of coming out. In my neighborhood, there is a young lady, she's going from grade 6 to grade 7, but she came out to her parents last year and they were looking forward to going to the parade for Pride to celebrate her. The thing is, Pride was canceled. So instead, we did a social distancing parade by her house for Pride so that she could have that. And my friend and I, we were in a minivan. So I had to go get my friends and we ended up running a little late, but we had all sorts of stuff on our van and my friend gave her a ton of stuff that she can now wear and use and stuff like that and do it for next year's Pride Parade. But it is education. And she was shocked how when she came out, she didn't come out to her parents first. This was actually part of the interesting story. She came out to her classmates at school first and they immediately rallied around her and everybody in the class, et cetera, and there might be people who will disagree with that, etc. But it was the fact that how do you tell a kid from grade 7 that who they are is a fact they have to deny and they should not be that, right? As an adult, I would feel I would just be like, all right, I'm out of here. I'm not sitting around for that explosion. But the thing is that that is education, changing those views on sexuality, racism, other sort of normative issues. Now, again, I'm presenting, just so we're all very clear, I'm from the social sciences. So I'm presenting you the social sciences side of this. This is not to say that there aren't other issues in relation to engineering or others, but I'm just pointing that out. The other thing is that you have to involve local shareholders. Education, just like with most technologies, et cetera, and changes, cannot take traction if it doesn't work. Let's say I mail to you the exam and say, I need you to mail it back. You folks are not mail natives in the sense of what we call digital natives. You're gonna maybe know where your post box is. Do you know if your post box comes to a registered location? Do you know it comes to your house? And some of you probably don't even get mail, so much less worry about finding a mailbox. So you need to be there with the local shareholders. Now that may mean that some of them will disagree with ideas. Some of those ideas are very tricky to move by. But you have to decide where you want to go to. So consider, for example, in Iraq, after they rebuilt the constitution, they excluded women from constitutional powers, which they had when the Americans were actually first in place from 2005 to 2009, I think is when they put the constitution through. Women had rights, but those rights disappeared thereafter. Good idea, bad idea? Well, bad idea, I would argue. However, one of the arguments that was made is we need massive education to encourage women's involvement, and that will hopefully help us to bring more women in and get those changes. Now, I'm not going to suggest for good or for bad. That's not the point here. The point is that you have to recognize that local shareholders have to be involved in whatever changes you're looking to do. And the final point that it raises from a transitional justice point of view is that we have multiple generations of people that need to be worked with. So we want to encourage people of all ages to take part. So you want to also be thinking about in your innovation, okay, this is great for if you're a tween or a teen or if you're a millennial, okay, but how is that going to work with, say, people that are older? Millennials tend to have great ideas. They tend to have digital stuff. That's all great. We can all acknowledge that. But the people that have the money are older than them, right? The people that have inheritance are way older than them on top of that. So do they play a role? Is there a way in which this can be done? A lot of these sort of huge amounts of venture capitalists that you're seeing, they're not 20 somethings, they're 50, 60-year-olds that have a lot of money and want to invest in the future. But at some level, it's not just about, are they going to make any money? It's like, are they seeing things that are relevant to them and they think are going to meet some of their larger social goals and other things like that? So it's important to sort of speak to multiple generations. And I think transitional justice reminds us that it's not just about those of us of a certain age group or below us or tweens or teens. It's going to be about larger numbers of people. We want to incorporate them as well. And that was just a source for that. So I think education must consider a number of things: language, how we talk about it, how we engage with it. Do we understand the language? Even when it comes to the digital world, not everybody gets what the digital world is about. So you have to use a language that will allow that person to engage with you. So you have to understand some measure of history, why some ideas are going to work or not, because of the historical record of what you're doing, right? If you say, well, one of our team building exercises is everybody should throw a shoe at the other person. For us, throwing a shoe doesn't make much of a difference. In Middle Eastern culture, for example, if you throw a shoe at someone, that is a fundamental sign of disrespect, right? So maybe not involve an exercise that involves throwing articles of clothing. Think of some other contextual aspect that you could do that. We also have to then think about how our curriculums need to change, to innovate, to allow for ideas, to develop with new technologies, but also consider what matters. As we discussed before, digital systems are going to change the way we teach, but we also need to be able to still have social interaction and stuff like that. So a curriculum that is totally devoid of any form of interaction is going to be a problem, just as any innovation that doesn't engage with people, doesn't allow them to do stuff, is probably not going to gain traction. We have to incorporate experiences. People come from diverse experiences. They have experiences that can inform, that can hinder, but it's better if you learn about what those experiences are before you come up with what you're going to do, right? And I'll give you one example. When I was in business class, we developed this cool thing about, getting a hinge onto freezers that sort of open up. They have a lid and you sort of open them up like that. And a lot of freezers didn't, right? And I was like, okay, well, this sounds like a good idea. And then I went to this place and they said, yeah, we don't always provide that. We provide like a little thing like with car hoods where you put that up. He goes, but if you move up one model, it comes with this automatic thing. In fact, I was shown this one there, you can press a button and the lid goes up and down on its own. I thought it was a great idea. Our presentation actually did well. We got an A+ on it, but it was because we went out and did the market research, and it turned out our entire thing was not needed. It was just a question if you had enough money. So no company was going to add this. We'd have to market this as something you can add on to your fridge for yourself, but we weren't going to get mass sales out of this, right? So you have to go out and get that experience or find the experience of others, or maybe I should have asked somebody who has a freezer what their experience was like. But I think that's where experience becomes important, and bringing those experiences in through education is important. You're going to need experts. There are people that know stuff about this sort of stuff. I do international relations. I do transitional justice as a part of my international conflict stuff. But TJ in education, I had to read about it. I had to read a book, a bunch of articles, etc., to get a sense of what this is about. So I turned to experts on that, and I asked some of my students what sort of things they liked and they didn't, to get a sense of it. Local politics matter. Education is always local politics. Think of books that are banned. Some places have Harry Potter. Harry Potter was being banned a decade ago for different reasons than what is getting banned for now, right? If you're keeping up on what's happening with J.K. Rowling, every year somebody's banning her for something, fair enough. But this is involved in local politics. In other places, J.K. Rowling is back on the curriculum because now they believe she supports views that they think are valid, right? So local politics often determines what sort of education people get and what sorts of things they're going to learn and grow from. Teacher training is very important to this. One of the things that you folks are going to find, and I find for sure when I look at the way in which we're doing online education, is that we need to be educated about what we're doing, but this is not often available to us. So if you would like to see whatever you're doing brought into the education system, please be prepared or set aside time to think about or incorporate how you would get the people that have to make this happen. Throwing them to the wolves is not the way to go. That's not how your innovation is going to take up. Consider, for example, the whole micro loan process for women. In particular, that was targeted to 20 years ago, but now it's expanded in different realms and so forth. And it's also being used to assist trans people, to assist them to start businesses and do stuff as well. Part of that involves is training in financials, training in understanding how markets work, training in figuring out how communal systems of production and so forth work. So for that, you have to train people that will then train these young women initially, but now other people as well. So think about teacher training in this process, because you have to build these capacities up. Don't just assume that whatever innovation you have, that's a great idea, I'll just figure out how to do it, right? It doesn't work that way. When it comes down to education, you need good, solid training, because that training is what's going to get passed on to you as the student, right? If you feel your professor or your teacher doesn't have adequate training in something, then you're not likely to engage with it, because you're going to go da, 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 and that person won't be able to handle when you have problems of learning and education as well. So this leads us then to just some samples of this. And I provide this just by background to show you how in different countries, how it's gone from a national commission around truth and reconciliation to the ideas over here, which are actually more helpful, like make teaching of human rights obligatory, discuss reparations and educational benefits for children of victims. So this is not broad scale reparations. This is the idea, for example, in Chile, the people that were the victims of the Pinochet regime or the attacks on indigenous groups in particular, reparations would be tied to them, but focusing, say, on educational benefits, right? So the idea here is where organizing something more broadly comes into a specific recommendation focused on the educational aspect. So if you come up with a better way to distill water to make it drinkable, maybe one of the things to do is teach people the chemistry behind what you decided, right? I mean, one of the questions that's always asked, and we've asked as kids, we all remember those days. Remember when we were kids and we always used to ask the question, why? Remember how angry we were when people would say, because I told you so, or because it's better? We were all upset about that. We want to know why. Why would something happen? So if you've come up with an innovation or an idea, explain to the people why that makes sense, why it works, or why is it that you would recommend this? So why would you want to have a curriculum that addresses human rights and promotes tolerance and respect? That's the recommendation, but we need a why to that. Why is that being done? Why would you want to create such a curriculum? So why that innovation becomes important. This is some more from Timor Leste, from Sierra Leone, from Liberia. And again, this is the URL. Unfortunately, I can't put it in right now because I can't get the chat to come up on this for the moment. Let me see if I can. But I can send these links to Sharon and she can post them, or I'll see if I can get them up a little bit later in this regard. But you can find these from that report as well. And this is another one from Kenya, from the Solomon Islands. You're seeing a lot of stuff about teaching human rights and so forth. It's very important because that's what we do in TJ. But this is sort of where I want to come to this. Like, this is where transitional justice has its spheres of activities, right? So it's redressing reparations, truth seeking, memorialization, that is getting that history out, identification of what those rights and abuses are, identification of perpetrators, victims, and bystanders. Now, this is important. It's not just about who did the wrong. It's also about who suffered the wrong, but also the folks that didn't do anything. Think about the George Floyd case, just to take something very happening right now. We have a sense of this and this, but this is a huge issue. This is really where the crux of this issue is at now. How have we as society, as bystanders, if you will, how did the other police officers as bystanders? What are the people that were videotaping, but we're not getting involved? What do we make of them, right? And this is always the case, right? People often say, and many of you are probably millennials, you're like, so you're going to do it? Oh, sorry, often it's the question that they'll pose is, so you're going to do anything, or you're just going to stand there and do Snapchatting, right? This is a problem, but we have to ask that question of ourselves as bystanders. Then there's the question of institutional reform. I think democracy still does matter. I think most of you would like to have a say in how your politics works, how your government works. And I think we need to have education that will address that. And then criminal justice, and then how do we go about condemning violence so that society itself changes. So this leads to the question of the educational contribution, which is what I'm focused in for here. But ask yourself, if you wanted to make a social contribution or a contribution to changing the way in which policing operates or something operates, you need to ask yourself, what is the activity? What is it going to do? But then what is the broader thing that you're trying to accomplish? And this is where we get into the component of peace building. Transitional justice is a process. Part of that process involves changing the way education works to the greater goal of building peace in societies where there was violence before. So education is part of that puzzle, but the puzzle itself is part of a bigger picture that we're trying to put together here. Now, if we were all in front of everybody, this is where I sort of really like this, really like my presentations to really get going, is I ask people, do any of this or not resonate with your education experience? So for example, did you ever find that you were in a situation where you're trying to explain something, truth seeking, right, about your experience, the violence or oppression that you suffered, etc.? Was it dealt with in a way that allows us to understand the complex conflict and issues and legacies around that, right? In the previous session, somebody was mentioning how they felt education was difficult for them because in their field there wasn't representation of who they are. So that would mean that they feel some measure of oppression, in the sense that the people that they're seeing successful in their field, none of them look like them, none of them represent their experiences. So are the instructors trying to say, okay, so what is your experience? Well, this has been okay, so how do we deal with that? So then it's up to the instructor, I would suggest, in that environment that that person was facing, to think about how they could challenge that process. Now, my recommendation was that you need to have in your own network people that can help you, right? I can't solve every problem, nor should you aim to do that. You should be looking to other people to bring some of those expertise in this regard. So this is where I think, the idea of this resonant experience when it comes to these things, this is in the case of transitional justice. I like to work with specifics, and I ask you to think broadly about what you're like to bringing, but you can see where these puzzle pieces go. What is one aspect of transitional justice? Education. What is the broader aspect of peace building and rebuilding societies that education can work with? So with that, I just want to close on the idea that, again, it's meant to inspire and encourage you, but let's be clear that transitional justice does get pushback. Not everybody believes that we should just go ahead and do the right thing, right? Whether it's Donald Trump, whether it's Viktor Orban or others like that, there's disagreements on stuff. And think about over here, for those of you who know Aung San Suu Kyi, for her situation where she went from being a human rights icon, won the Peace Prize, to making an argument for why the treatment of the Rohingya in Myanmar is valid and why it should be pursued. And, if people have so much a problem, all that, her Peace Prize, and now nobody wants to talk to her from one side of the equation, but she's become suddenly a, darling of the other side of the equation, if you will. It doesn't mean it's all going to work out forever, because this is historical and things change. First thing is that there's a problem of access. Not everybody has access to education. We are very privileged in Canada that roughly half of our population gets to post-secondary education. There are entire communities where half the population doesn't even get to primary education, much less worry about post-secondary education. When you complete your university degree, you will be part of, I think it's something like 10 to 15% of the global population. Go to a master's, you get to about 6 to 5%. And once you hit the PhD, that's 1 to 2% of 7 billion people, right? So we need to be cautious that we don't want to oversell whatever innovation or aspect, like in this case, education. We need to be clear that this involves resources, right? In Rwanda, for example, they got fancy new computers and everything else for part of the transitional part of the committees that were doing the work, the truth commissions. The only problem was they hadn't set up electrical lines in the place, right? So they didn't have paper and pen that they sort of needed, but they had all these fancy computers that nobody could use. So resources need to be matched. And sometimes it's not just a question, as I'm pointing out, of having resources. It's just the resources aren't going to work. So if all your innovation is online to a group of people that don't have Wi-Fi, that don't have access to electricity, how is that going to work? Some of you may already have friends that couldn't complete their university degree in the last little while because they do not have access to Wi-Fi. We had international students who could not, once they got home in their small village or even in their big urban center, the power runs, the rotating blackouts, the fact that their Wi-Fi is very limited, the shutdown of communications in certain countries because of the pandemic and other issues that were going on, they could not do the work. So we had to figure out ways to make sure people could actually get through this process to that. But just because you're bringing education to the table, not everybody thinks it's a great idea. You're going to get pushback. Further to that, that pushback is often from populists who think that the way that you're promoting, the ideas that you're promoting are problematic. Not everybody believes in we should all be part of the same world, we should love one another, etc. Right? So you have to be cautious that you're operating from a normative framework of what you think is important, but not everybody believes that. The other thing is that there is this tension always in education, and I think we've had people allude to this in terms of the conference as well, is that education often is about empathy and feelings and managing how you take care of each other, acknowledging soft skills, etc. But then the question becomes, shouldn't education be about learning how to write a resume, writing properly, understanding how Microsoft Office works? How do you run, an Excel function that works with an array? I don't know what that is. Those sound like fancy words, but I've seen them used on a Microsoft tutorial video on YouTube. So I think they matter, right? But I don't have that hard skill unto itself. So there's going to be pushback from people where they're going to say, well, I don't see how this manages hard skills and knowledge. Or the flip side, that it doesn't incorporate empathy and feelings. We get that often with the sciences where people go, well, this is all great for science, but have you thought about the ethical impact or the empathetic impact or how it's going to affect certain groups of people? So you're going to have to take a critical view of what you engage with. And that to me brings you right back to education. Engage education critically to bring changes that you think matter. So I'll close with that because there's a lot of different ideas, but I hope that hopefully that gives you some sense of what sorts of things I think are helpful for us to discuss or think about. And hopefully some of you will think about things that you think in terms of education that you would like to see happen, but also things in terms of how you're planning to bring your innovation and educate people about why it's useful, how it can make a difference, or how it can affect other people in some way. So please go ahead and let me know your questions or your thoughts, but I'm also very interested in your comments, right? If you're connecting what I've talked about to some background that I'm not familiar with, and that I'm familiar with political science. If you're a sociologist or a psychologist, I ain't got nothing on you either. So, and I probably don't have anything on the political scientist, I would argue as well, because I study one aspect of it. So I look forward to your commentary and look forward to hearing from you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Narain. It's currently 3:50, so we have room for one or two questions or comments.
Sure.
So first, there's a couple people who raised their hands. Raj, we'll take you first, and then we'll move from there.
Thank you, Doctor. I found your presentation very insightful, and it very clearly built on itself. So my question is actually about how education could assist in the actual transition itself, how it can potentially help ignite or motivate, stir on that paradigm shift in the culture, in the political conflict,
Yes.
or how it already has historically.
Yeah. So there's one thing to acknowledge right off the bat is that education can also reverse that process, right? So if we've come through a massive conflict and we educate ourselves about it and think about what happened, who things happened to, the way the narrative was written, etc., that can be there. But often history is written by the victors for the victors, right? So we have to be critical about that process, right? You know, you get the Civil War, but understanding the Civil War is different than, say, the US Civil War from the side that won or from the side that lost. So education does have an impact post-conflict, first of all, because it changes norms, right? It starts from the ground up to say, okay, children are first and foremost the norm contenders because parents school them in certain ways or believe certain ideas matter. So it can rebuild fractured relations. Oftentimes, relations change because children engage with other children. And usually children don't share the predilections that their parents do, and education can change them. Just to give you a sense of this, so the head of the US Nazi Party, or the Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan, was a guy named David Duke. He ended up leaving the place for, and again, this is the Ku Klux Klan White Nazi Party. The head of that organization is now a fellow by the name of David Black. And Mr. Black's son, who was a member of his party up until the point he went and got himself a PhD in Islamic studies at the University of Chicago. And so now he's an expert on Islamic studies. This is a guy who's the son of the former KKK leader of the United States. And he runs the largest Nazi website in the world called Stormfront. Through his education, through meeting people at university for his undergrad, for his MA, and eventually his PhD at the University of Chicago in Islamic studies, totally disowned what his parents said, totally goes against his father, speaks out against him, is anti-racist, works for, engages with BLM and stuff like that. So that's where I think education has its power, because it brings together people of different ideas, right? So I can tell economist jokes because I'm a political scientist, and Sharon can confirm I've told one or two in class. But my brother's an economist and he tells wicked political scientist jokes. But I'm not anti-economist or hateful of economists. It's because I engage with one and there's a humorous way in which we do it. And I think education can provide you a way to engage with ideas and people that you would not have otherwise, because you're coming together for the purpose of learning. Education is fundamentally why we come together, I think, at the end of the day, because we want to learn stuff and we want to learn broadly.
All right, thank you. We'll move on to our next question from Kaval. You should be unmuted.
Okay, so thank you for amazing talk. I really like the ideas you had about further education and how the world today really doesn't focus on kind of life skills, as you said, using Microsoft Office, using Excel and stuff like that. Recently I heard that Ontario was further expanding its curriculum to include coding and financial literacy from grades 1 to 8. And I think that was a really good step in the right direction. So my question to you is like, even though we're learning all these things in school, do you think like the governments globally should make something other than school a necessity, like by law to be like learning? Like,
Yep.
should they make some extracurriculars a necessity instead of having them as optional? Because I feel like, as you said, education is not just school-based, kind of like it's
Yeah.
more of a broad thing.
Yeah. So the issue with that, I would suggest to you, is on the student front, right? We have significant problems of mental health because students are overrun with extracurriculars. Now more so than ever, they're overrun with jobs because they don't have enough funding and so forth. So while we can tack on, do more extracurriculars to get into law school, do more extracurriculars to go into the HBA, in a sense, that's not going to help you in a sense, unless you're into the right networks, right? But networks are not opportunities that are sort of neutral, like an extracurricular. You go work in a homeless shelter, the next day you work out, you go to, say KPMG, and you spend 3 hours there working with somebody and learning stuff. I think that the issue is that if we're going to incorporate these, we should incorporate them in a way that is a little bit more particular and sustained, that gets you to where we are learning stuff. So this is the example that I'll give you to this is the classic question that I got when I was talking about We Charity to somebody and saying, look, the idea of We Charity, a place to work, giving you the opportunity to go elsewhere, etc., is actually caught up in a bunch of things that we call in politics or in academic literature, we call it voluntarism, where you get to have enough money to go travel around the world and see things in tourism, or it's called tragedy tourism, right? You go and you can watch from Mumbai, some poor kid who's 3 years old lifting bricks and taking it to build a building, right? That's tragedy tourism. Building a school for that kid is helpful, but it's not going to help that kid much if they still have to go to work. So what we need to do is we need to incorporate back ways that we can do something like that in an educational system. So my suggestion to them was, don't get involved with that. And I don't mean don't get involved in anything. I meant don't get involved with the we process, because I don't think it's going to get you an understanding of it. Instead, take our experiential learning course where you will go to El Salvador, or take, say, Ivy has one where you go and spend a couple of months in India as a part of an exchange in business school. We have ones in the medical program where you can go, or Engineers Without Borders, where you actually go as a part of a course and professor comes with you to assist you to learn. Not that the professor is going to give you lessons in the sand in the desert somewhere, but you take those opportunities to go to Ethiopia, go to India, go to Brazil. And also, very importantly, we have opportunities up north in Nunavut, up in Northern Ontario, because I'm in Ontario, to engage with those communities. So you're not engaging in tragedy tourism or volunteerism, but you're getting educated about that. Now, if our government supported that, what's the way to do it? Follow Denmark. Denmark gives you 1 year, now I believe it's still there, for you to go abroad, go anywhere in the world, or go to a multiple number of countries. They support you. They give you a certain amount of stipend. You can always work and do other things. And you can visit the world. You can see different things. You can get a job in India working as a bricklayer if you want to, right? But the whole idea is that that's structured into the program. So you don't have to worry about that year or incorporating the extracurriculars while you work 2 jobs, while you're trying to get the 80s to get into law school, business school. You're going to get a whole year off after you're done university to go and travel, to engage, to get new ideas. I mean, in the pandemic, obviously it's not going to work, but in another situation, and they're paying you to get a worldly education. And in Switzerland, where they actually do pay you while you're being mentored and apprenticed and stuff like that. Because the other problem we have is a lot of our businesses don't hire people and train them anymore. They expect the educational system to do that. So why not say we'll pay for a 3-month internship at KPMG or at We Charity or wherever you want to be. But this is about resources that need to be put into it, and a more organized way of doing this, not just saying to you, hey, Kaval, go wherever the heck you want. Oh, by the way, it's all on you. Because the first question you're going to have is, where am I going to get the money? Right? Instead, it's, you've got 1 year of support. make good on it, right? And you can even do like some of our internships do at Western. You can write a report afterwards and get credit for that. So you get one term that you were away, or the summer you were away, you were working, say, I had a student who worked as a part of a yogurt making operation for a poor village area in, I think it was Mozambique or Botswana. And she came back afterwards and she wrote a report, and that was a half credit for her, right? It beats taking an optional half credit in something you may not be interested in to do something. And she learned a lot. She learned a lot from being out in the field that way.
Alrighty. Thank you so much, Professor Narain.
Thank you.
So
Thank you for your questions.
no, thank you. At this time, that will conclude this session. If anyone has any other questions, Professor Narain, do you mind if we share your email with them?
Yep, no, I'll put it right into the chat right now. And this is my cell number. So it's already available on the net. So a student once told me they found it in a library in Pakistan because somebody had put it into the bathroom. I guess they were doing some work there, and so they texted me. I have no issue, you know, I mean, again, just be respectful in the same way you would want to be, just identify who you are. I usually text back to say, could you let me know? But you have my email address, you have my cell number. I am on LinkedIn if you want to go through that, if you weren't going to Circle, and I'm on Facebook. I'm not a big Insta person or stuff like that, but for other reasons. And there was already somebody that commented about how to manage your social media. So that's a whole other presentation, but you can find me through any of those things. And I'd be very happy to chat with anybody. I do apologize if any of you were planning to do a coffee chat. I just have work-related commitments this coming week. But that said, I'm very happy, as Sharon knows, to engage with you folks anytime and in another environment and even late at night. So by all means, feel free to connect with me about anything. Thank
you so much again for your time. I'm sure all of us found this presentation super insightful and a really good concrete take on the direction that sustainable education should and can take in the future. That being said, if anyone has any other questions about the rest of the day and how submission and judging is going to go, please, again, feel free to email us at events@hollowcircle.ca or message us on any of our social media platforms. But yeah, our next workshop will be taking place with Dr. Laura Jana, who was our keynote speaker this morning at 5 p.m. The link should be also either on the conference participant page or in your email as well. But thank you so much again for your time.
Thank you, Sharon.
And Professor Narain, I'll definitely be seeing you around soon as well.
Definitely.
All right.
Take care. Bye, everybody. Bye.